I can no longer park at my university where I work because I run a BlackBerry and it's incompatible with the app. So I can't download the app because it's a surveillance app. So I'm no longer allowed to park. Now, that's me in my privileged position as a professor here. Now, let's say that I am, an impoverished mother of four. I'm working 4 jobs. I can't afford a smartphone, and I need to use my car to get around town to make enough money to support my kids. And suddenly, I don't even have access to parking.
There's all kinds of evidence that talks about how the data surveillance tools and data mining tools are used specifically to target particular communities and how negative those impacts can be.
When we are being surveilled or when data is being gathered about us, we don't know which parts of it are useful to whom or for whom and to use for what purpose. The same data that is being collected by one organization or one company or one government could be used for different purposes for very different means by a different group of people.
If someone opts out of something, but the system is set up so that it cannot function, if someone opts out, how do we then think about building those systems where it's like we can allow people to opt out, but still have this thing function in the way that it was meant to function? And we should build those things like that. So you have to make space for people to opt out. And I think that's really important, especially when talking about surveillance technologies in education and in any context really. But I think it's really important to be all right, people don't have to use this. And what does that look like? And we can design for that. We can think about that. We can include more people when we do it that way.
I think a big value in the report is its focus on exposed groups. It's something that's often left out of the conversation. We just assume that there's an objective or kind of neutral perspective about how privacy is being invaded. We see this all the time working in civil liberties and human rights, from everywhere from algorithmic policing, focusing on more lower class neighborhoods, to even social media surveillance, where, for instance, Black Lives Matter was even surveilled by the Canadian military. That's just a really good example of how the state scrutiny and state surveillance is extremely disproportionate in Canada.
There are always groups who are marginalized, vulnerable. We aren't in this digital world altogether. We're in it in a very segmented way.
Data justice and social justice has to be front and center because you can't design these systems without at least making political decisions about how you're intervening in the systems, lest you reflect blindly the inequities that exist. I mean, if you're trusting the data, well, it's very not we know the data is biased. We live in generations of structural racism, in a history of a society with genocide with Indigenous peoples. Those are things that are baked into the data now. I think the question before us, the one that I think I'm excited about, is what are the ways or responsibilities of this moment of change to be one to actually build a better society where we foreground these commitments where we've made, ultimately build a more inclusive society that I'd like to be part of.
There's been a tendency with the commercialization of data processes and government actually supporting that process for us to think that really, from the point of view of those large organizations, the key thing is more data for people, or rather about people, rather than thinking about data for people or with people, such that we could see that the human needs and human lives are what are critical in this, not the data. But it does depend on responsible collection and analysis and treatment.
This different level of surveillance really has a chilling effect, as we see, because some groups are then able to feel very comfortable expressing themselves and letting their demands of the state and society in general be known, whereas everybody else, those who are in the overexposed groups, can't even open their mouths without being criminalized.
We need to go beyond consultation. So we often get a public consultation piece around the use of a particular technology, maybe in public services, or maybe even in the private sector. And we get to the end of a consultation and that's that point shut down. Things like privacy by design and things like more participatory approaches actually are careful to foreground the voices of different communities, perhaps racialized minorities, LGBTQ plus communities, around how these technologies actually affect them in a meaningful way and in a way which produces co-designed and co-created outcomes.
As advocates for people that want to thrive in our communities, and have good experiences and be able to associate with one another freely without being afraid of being spied on, either by private or public interests, it's really, really difficult to do. And, you know, we're a number of experts up there, and we do have privilege and we do have access to experts and public decision makers. And still we get stymied over and over again. We're trying to use the tools that we know are available and they don't work. Between, you know, the crisis in just policing oversight generally, on top of the outdated privacy and associated other legislation.
We need to bring people's stories to the table because that's what's going to make a difference for policymakers in this space.